Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome everyone to the TISA student podcast that is run by the students at the Islamic Seminary of America, where we, alhamdulillah, have been taking classes now for a few semesters. And we want to present at least some of the things that we do at the seminary. And today we are fortunate and honored to have Dr. Julie Lowe with us. She is a professor at the Islamic Seminary of America. And a little bit about her: she is a doctor, she's a PhD from the University of Toronto in Islamic Studies, or I believe Islamic law, if that's correct. She can correct me here in a second. She's also a lawyer by training, and she has, mashallah, I think an extensive background in terms of Islamic knowledge. She's a memorizer of the Quran, a hafiza in the 10 qira'at. She actually teaches Quran as well regularly. She graduated from Al Maghrib back in the day, the Maghrib Institute, and she also attended um, in London. What was the college in London that you went to, Dr. Julie?
So London was my master's, the School
Oh, okay. There you
of
go.
Oriental and African Studies, which is a university in London that specializes in things related to the Middle East, to Africa, to Asia. So a lot of Islamic studies there. I think you were on the topic of traditional Islamic studies, so you maybe
Yeah.
wanted to add there rather than London that I've been to Jordan multiple times. That would probably be more
Oh,
on
there
the
you go.
theme.
Yeah, mashallah, mashallah. Yeah. I mean, anything else you want to add that I didn't put in here? These are literally just from my notes. So if you want to add anything
I know. I can just
in
add that
terms
in
of
terms of
background.
my PhD research, which will probably be relevant or come up in the context of our discussion tonight. I was looking at issues of rape and sexual assault. So how is it classified legally in Islamic law, as well as in the legal system in modern Jordan? So a very gendered topic, of course.
Yeah, no, I understand that. Of course, I'm joined by another fellow student, Manu Bansal, who's also in Canada. And by the way, Dr. Julie is located in Canada as well. So we have two Canadians, mashallah, on the call. So, Dr. Julie, a little bit about your research. So, obviously, like you said, the research that you've done is highly gendered. It talks about, I think, very contentious issues. This might seem as a very controversial issue, at least in some circles. What kind of drew you? What was, some of your intentions behind that research? And just tell us a little bit more about it.
Yeah, so in a sense, it's almost not contentious in the Muslim community, even though it should be. Because people have a very simplified idea of how our tradition dealt with rape and a very inaccurate idea. So they kind of read in what they want, and for that reason, it's not contentious because they simply don't know what the jurist actually said about it. As for why I chose the topic, of course, I was looking for something at the time as a PhD student that would allow me to do an entire dissertation. I kind of got into this topic in my master's, and there's not a ton of research on the topic. There is actually a book by another academic called her name is Hina Azam. She looks at earlier Islamic law and how it deals with rape in particular. But I wanted to look at later jurists as well as bring in other madhabs that she doesn't deal with. So I brought in the Shafi'i madhab, which she doesn't include in her research, as well as not only the rape of females, but also looking at, for example, the rape of males, which is not something that there's been much academic discussion on. Um, that was my main. That was the main way I got into this. But of course, having gone through this now, I'm hoping to actually publish some articles. I have something on the way that is will hopefully be beneficial for the Muslim community in terms of dealing with people who might be hesitant to either testify in a case of rape or report a case of rape because they're concerned, for example, about zina and it being intertwined with adultery and fornication. So, addressing some of these issues to hopefully relieve any tension that Muslims in our community might feel in cases of rape about reporting from an Islamic legal perspective.
Yeah. No, that's a lot. I mean, that's a lot to take in. You know, the issue, like you said, I don't. The way our Muslim community has been, dealing with these types of issues can definitely improve, and the understanding of it, I think, can grow, inshallah. So, yeah, we look forward to checking out those articles and reading, some of that material more, inshallah. So along these topics, right? The issue, for example, that you mentioned, rape and these things, is intertwined with the issue of gender, intertwined with the issue of justice. How is, the issue when it comes to justice and the issue of gender? And we have, a few different paradigms that people come from, right? There's the Western paradigm, there's the Islamic paradigm. Although I'm not necessarily an advocate of using these terms. I don't think that Islam is inherently non-Western or that Western inherently excludes Islam. But for the sake of simplicity, what are some of the differences between kind of these two viewpoints, so to speak, on this issue?
Yeah, I think you just hit a couple important points on the head while you were in the process of asking about gender justice.
Yeah.
And one, if you're asking what is Western gender justice and what is Islamic gender justice, what you started alluding to, which is the West is not a monolith, and even Islamic thought is not a monolith. So Western thought on gender, as we know, has evolved over, the last there's been a huge amount of change even in the last, say, 25 years, 30 years, 40 years, 50 years. And within the West, you have, people of varying viewpoints as well. And within Islam, if you ask somebody who, say, takes a more literalist reading of the tradition, say somebody who ascribes to the modern Salafi movement, you're going to get a very different answer on some of these issues than somebody who follows a slightly different interpretation. And even among the madhabs, you're going to have somewhat different approaches to certain gender topics. As well, even the term gender justice, I mean, this is a very modern term. You're not going to open a book of fiqh and find a section on gender justice or a scholar expressing his views on gender justice, because the term itself is a very 21st century term. That being said, I mean, if we look at, for lack of a better word, mainstream Western thought as expressed by, people who would ascribe to feminism, people within the domain of, women, gender, sexuality studies, people who are involved with gender activism, I would say that generally speaking, and of course these are just sort of broad generalizations, you're going to see a lot of emphasis on notions of equality, so legal equality between men and women, in every aspect, anything from access to education to pay equity to, equality in laws of marriage and divorce. You'll see emphasis on women's empowerment, which can be through various means, through campaigns targeting violence against women. It can be through, advocating for the woman's right to control her own body through things like birth control. And you also have a lot of advocacy now for the idea of gender as a non-binary concept. So that sort of gender justice of recognizing, that gender is not a fixed concept and that people's gender is fluid and so forth. Islamically, again, within, for lack of a better word, mainstream Islam, and this is all somewhat simplified as we know, it's a little bit different because you have much more emphasis on revelation and what does the Quran say, what does the Sunnah say. So these are sources that are, of course, absent in the Western discourse by and large. And there's a lot of, I would say we see a contemporary discourse among Muslims of the idea of gender complementarity as gender justice. And the idea that revelation, does contain certain roles for women and certain roles for men, and that these are complementary. I think it is somewhat of a modern discourse, though. You're not necessarily going to find quite the same, you're not going to find it expressed the same way among pre-modern scholars, but, these are some of the basics of gender justice from a Western standpoint and then from an Islamic standpoint. Mm-hmm.
Sorry, so I was just gonna jump in there. I heard a lot of positive things that can come out of gender justice in what you've said. But the question is, was something that we simply can't ignore is that a lot of Muslims will look at feminism, and of course, we know that it's come in many ways, but we're gonna bypass all of that just for the sake of time. But why is it that Muslims feel that this movement has been a problem within Islam?
Um, are you talking about Western feminism or are you talking about Islamic feminism?
So it's not. So
Or
you know
both?
what? I was hoping that you can define what Islamic feminism is, because some people say there is no such thing as Islamic feminism. So are we appropriating that term? What exactly is it, and is it really bad for Islam?
Okay, so maybe we should just take a small step backwards and perhaps deal with Western feminism briefly. I know that we can't get into all of the details here. We did an entire class on that, an entire evening
Absolutely.
lecture. Plus, we
No.
had the first weekend where we were dealing somewhat indirectly with
Yeah.
that as well.
Which, by
But
the way,
just yeah.
just a quick shameless plug. If anybody's interested, that for this topic, we did. Me and Manu, we were students with Dr. Julie, and we took a whole semester's worth of discussing this very topic. So, with that said, if anybody's interested, sign up for the classes, inshallah. But Dr. Julie, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, no, not a problem. Plugs are always good because we are looking to
Yeah.
attract more students to TISA, and hopefully we will be reoffering this course. I don't know when, but at some point in the future,
Inshallah,
inshallah. So
inshallah soon. Yeah.
all the new students, hopefully, will have them attend as well. But yeah, it's sorry, Western feminism. This is something I think in the broader Muslim community that, at least among certain individuals, there is a lot of gross oversimplification and simply disparaging it. And people often don't even know what Western feminism is. They just have these very broad conceptions, and somehow it all became haram and horrible and bad. And I think realistically, there's good and bad in these sorts of movements. From the perspective here of you could say of a mainstream practicing Muslim, you have very good things that have come out of the movement. Certain things that we've already mentioned, such as pay equity, such as um, what else? Access to education. These sorts of things are all very good Islamically, and we tend to have a very also overly simplified discourse about Islamic history, and somehow we think that Muslim women have always had it great, access to all these rights. And there's a couple of things. One is, I mean, you do find certain statements among Muslim scholars in the past, such as advocating for illiteracy among women that are arguably not from the Quran or Sunnah. And you also find that even where something might legally be upheld, is it upheld in society? Right? So the things that Western feminists have advocated for, many of these things we as Muslims benefit from them, and there's no problem Islamically. Of course, there are other aspects, such as the issue of the gender binary and so forth, that definitely are problematic. But to simply disparage Western feminism or feminism in general, I don't think uh, I don't think has any sound basis. To get back to Islamic feminism that you wanted to get to, there are so when we say Islamic feminism, you can use that term in a couple of different meanings. Sometimes you have practicing Muslim women who call themselves Muslim feminists, and they don't mean feminism in the academic sense or in the sense that it would typically be understood by a Western feminist activist. Generally speaking, they're talking about upholding women's rights within a very traditional paradigm. And their concerns are more like, I don't know, ensuring Muslim women can go to university, right? And not be, they don't want them, their families to marry them off super young or something like this, or they want to have access to the board in the masjid, or things that are completely unproblematic Islamically. And there are people who would say, people who are more familiar with feminism, who would say that this is a complete misuse of the term feminist, because at the end of the day, feminism, as it is understood academically, as it's understood in the broader feminist movement, it does have certain notions of equality that just don't align with this sort of simplistic usage of Muslim feminist. But certainly, if somebody's using it in that sense, there's no problem from an Islamic perspective. We also find, though, the more organized movement of Islamic feminism is a movement that is advocated for among certain people in academia. And this is a movement that seeks to reinterpret the Quran in light of Western feminist notions of equality. So to read in absolute and complete equality between men and women into the Quran, so that you basically get rid of certain historical doctrines that are seen as problematic, such as different rulings for divorce and so forth. And you end up with a version of Islam where, you know, everything gender related is exactly as you would find in mainstream Western society. And this definitely is problematic from the perspective of mainstream Muslims, not just because it seems to overlook quite a number of explicit verses, but also because the people who adhere to this movement, they also have started going in a certain direction of questioning the divine nature of the Quran, saying that, you know, well, maybe we need to rethink the Quran itself. How is it actually the speech of God? Is it the speech of God? Because it seems that to actually arrive at our goals, we need to go a little bit further than we have. So there are certainly problems there. I'm not sure if that answers your question. I'll go back to you.
For sure. So it seems that when we say Islamic feminism, that it had to have come out of. I mean, it's not coming out of a vacuum. So there's obviously a tug of war between the tradition itself and what people want to, or how people want to reinterpret the Quran. So I'm going to read off two verses from the Quran just so we know which ones we're going to be specifically dealing with. And I was wondering if you can tell me what would be a more traditional interpretation of these verses versus, you know, how do people or feminists today reinterpret these verses to bring about more gender equality and justice. So the first verse, which I'll call the preference verse, which is 434 in the Quran, says, and you know, every translation is going to be a bit of a tafsir of it. So I tried to make it as plain sense interpreted from the Arabic as possible, but there's some words that are still going to be, you know, interpolated. So the verse goes, men are, actually I'll pull it up from the Quran. I kind of shortened it a bit.
الرجال قوامون على النساء بما فضل الله بعضهم على بعض وبما أنفقوا من أموالهم. Yeah.
Absolutely. So it says in the clear Quran, the one that I'm holding, men are the caretakers of women, as men have been provisioned by Allah over women and tasked with supporting them financially. And righteous women are devoutly obedient, and when alone, protective of what Allah has entrusted with them. And if you sense ill conduct from your wife, advise them first. If they persist, do not share their beds. But if they still persist, then discipline them gently. But if they change their ways, do not be unjust to them. Surely Allah is most high, all great. So that's 434. Then there's another verse in Surah Al-Baqarah. The second surah of the Quran, verse 228, that says, divorced women must wait 3 monthly cycles before they can remarry. It is not lawful for them to conceal what Allah has created in their wombs if they truly believe in Allah and the last day, and their husbands reserve the right to take them back within the period if they desire reconciliation. Women have rights similar to those of men equitably, although men have a degree of responsibility in brackets above them, and Allah is Almighty, All-Wise. So those are the two verses that often are cited in many of the books that you might read of Islamic reformers of our time. What is the traditional interpretation of this verse, and also how do modern reformers or people in the Islamic feminism movement bring about justice through these?
Okay, so I'm going to trim your question down a little bit because at this point you cited like multiple points of contention. Because this, even within this first verse that you mentioned in Surah An-Nisa, the verse 34 of Surah An-Nisa, there's two separate issues here. You have الرجال قوامون, what does it mean that men are قوامون over women, right? I don't remember which translation you gave, sometimes protectors, maintainers, however you want to translate it. Then you also have this issue of disobedience of the wives. Then you just cited a separate verse that deals with men having a degree over women. So let's concentrate on the idea of قوامون just to answer, or to give you, I guess, to give our listeners a taste of perhaps traditional.
No, that's great.
That,
go ahead.
interpretation.
Yeah, that's perfect.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so I was actually looking briefly before the podcast at this, and I pulled up a traditional tafsir of Ibn Kathir. So his tafsir of this verse is pretty unapologetic and very unpalatable, even to Muslims today. Right? He says regarding the husband, هو رئيسها وكبيرها والحاكم عليها ومؤدبها إذا أعوجت. Basically, to just summarize that in English, he's really like the one who is kind of over her and in control of her and her disciplinarian and all this kind of stuff. It's interesting, even the translation that you cited, you can see how far, even just like a typical mainstream Muslim today, is from this. Right? Nobody would ever frame it this way, but if you pull up a traditional tafsir, they will say these sorts of things unapologetically. If we just go to the Muslim feminists, they have multiple ways of reinterpreting this. One is by historicizing it, so saying that something like this, the idea of men being qawwamun, again, however you want to interpret that, that it is something that was applicable once upon a time in 7th century Arabia, because they weren't ready for a huge change at that time. It was a very patriarchal society, and therefore this was like to rein in the patriarchy, to put limits on the husband. But at this point in history, we've moved beyond that, and we no longer need to apply this verse in this sort of literal meaning anymore. They will also read in conditions to the verse that are not mentioned in the Quran. So, for example, one of the Muslim feminists will say that it means that the husband can advise the wife, but only under very, very specific conditions, and she doesn't have to accept that. So, reading in conditions. They also will talk about interpreting in light of other verses. So we have certain verses that are more egalitarian in the Quran, such as a verse in At-Tawbah that says men and women, or the believers, men and women, are awliya, so they're allies of each other. And they will claim that because we have these sorts of egalitarian verses, that something like the verse that we're dealing with here in Surah An-Nisa cannot actually have this hierarchical meaning. I'll just give you one more way that they reinterpret is the idea that a hierarchy, it contravenes Tawheed, that by making the man somehow above the woman, that is making him into a godlike figure, and we know that, Tawheed is the essence of Islam, that shirk or idolatry is completely the opposite of what we're supposed to do as Muslims, and therefore the verse cannot possibly have the meaning that it's traditionally been understood to have, because you're in essence committing shirk. So these are the polar opposites in essence, and the mainstream community today, interestingly, seems to have taken a somewhat middle position, even just from the translations of the Quran that we have. And this raises a lot of questions, of course. To what extent can we reinterpret, assuming you don't want to go the direction of that Muslim feminists have gone, to what extent can we as practicing Muslims who give some weight to the tradition reinterpret verses like this? And as we talked about quite a lot in our class, there aren't always easy answers to this, and it's something that, because our community by and large unfortunately likes to brush some of these issues under the rug, like we talked about this quote from Ibn Kathir, nobody would bring that up. People often don't even know that this is a type of discourse that we find in some of the classical texts. we unfortunately don't have a lot of work being done on this, and we do need to change that because, even though of course we have many other issues that we need to deal with as well, I think it is important for our communities today because of the society that we live in that we do deal a little bit more explicitly with some of these issues of gender and look to come up with certain solutions and interpretations that are respectful of the Quranic text, or that that don't just read away the Quranic text, but that are also responsive to our modern needs.
So if one wants to remain faithful to the Book of Allah and follow this like somewhat word for word, um, is it fair to say that maybe our traditional scholars of the past really had no reason to reinterpret it, and they interpreted it based on just the environment that they lived in? That patriarchy already existed. It's not something that Muslims came up with, but because it already existed, they interpreted verses from that side of things.
So what you're mentioning is a claim, of course, we find in Islamic feminism that everything was just interpreted in light of patriarchy, and I mean, my own position on this is that the truth probably lies somewhere in the middle. Do you find influence of past cultures on certain interpretations? Of course. Again, we just saw something that nobody would ever say today. Nor does the Quranic text necessarily require this, right? This is a tafsir. This is somebody's reading of the verse. And to bring up something that we've already mentioned, the idea of encouraging illiteracy among women that we find in past texts. This is not something that is required by the tradition by any means, but we do find this, and we find, this is definitely an influence of the culture of previous centuries where these sorts of things were considered normal. Very interestingly, though, when we look at our tradition, we also find positions that are quite friendly towards women, which is what we like to concentrate on. I remember an example that we gave in class is the fact that I don't think you find any scholars that don't uphold the verses of inheritance, right, for women. So even though the culture was patriarchal, this is a very explicit verse, and they upheld that despite whatever influences. As well, the idea of women being able to enter into contracts independently, of having property rights, they did uphold these things. So to say that scholars were only influenced by their society and just like read everything or like interpreted the Quran in a manner that is only a reflection of their society, I don't think is accurate. But did it have some influence on their interpretation of certain things, especially more ambiguous things or things that are very open to interpretation, like the word qawamun? I would say yes. And in these more ambiguous matters, these are areas where for sure there is room for a degree of reinterpretation today, and for coming up with slightly different readings than you will find in the classical texts.
Yeah,
Is,
I was
is
gonna
it?
say. Oh, I
Go
was gonna
ahead.
say. The tafsir that Ibn Kathir does, and even the not wanting girls to get educated. There are some of these notions that still exist in our community, right? And we said that I think a lot of them know that it's not PC, politically correct, and a lot of them know that it's not necessarily palatable for most people, so they won't necessarily say it out loud. But I've been told this multiple times by people. Like, for example, when my wife was still in school finishing up her degree, some people came up to me and they were like, "Chef, why is your wife going to school? She doesn't need to work." And I'm like, "She's not going to work to just get a job. I mean, she's not going to school just for a job, right? She wants to. I want my wife to be educated." And he's looking at me. He's like, "Why?" Well, one guy was like, "Shit, if she's educated, she'll start to give you trouble, and she'll have her own like opinions, blah blah blah." And I was just shocked that this is happening in the 21st century still. But you have these notions, and I think so. Obviously, like these types of people, we've talked to them. We can try to engage. I can kind of show like, "Hey, look, this doesn't." But I mean, I think in some ways we are fighting an uphill battle. And then on the on the same level, we're also fighting against the other extreme, right? So, like you said, that middle is sometimes tough to have because you don't want to take it too far to where it no longer resembles what perhaps the intention of the text was, and so
Yeah, I mean, I think some of
how do we
these.
balance that?
I was just gonna say some of the notions you're mentioning are like the resistance against certain notions of gender that are widespread in our society today. I find there is a pretty big difference between people from certain cultures overseas. Even when I was in Jordan, certain things that would be said to me, nobody would say them here. Um, Versus, say, like second, third generation Muslims in North America, of course, because we're all influenced by our society, right? And I think that reconsidering some of this stuff, I mean, it's essential for the longevity of Islam in North America because we live here. People are going to be influenced by notions of gender here, by other things here, and that's something that's completely natural because we forget, being overseas, you're influenced by whatever is there. It's not a bad thing to have a degree of influence by the society around you, which is something normal. But unless we are willing to engage with our text and our tradition and look at some of this stuff more seriously, you will end up losing quite a lot of people to broader society because they're not going to find a way to reconcile their faith with notions that are prevalent in the society around them. So it's not so much a question of debating with people who still hold other ideas, but I think of making sure that we have a sustainable Islam essentially for Muslims in North America in the long term.
I was hoping to ask two other questions about with respect to the equality between men and women from an Islamic paradigm. So, if we shed some light on verse 228 of Surah Al-Baqarah, it says that women have rights similar to those of men equitably, although men have a degree above them. Is it possible that you can still remain traditional and kind of restrict the meaning of this to being only within the confines of, initiating marriage or even initiating a divorce?
Yeah, so just to be clear, I mean, this is not my area of research, so I haven't worked on this verse, but conditions are read into the Quran regularly, right, in the tradition. So even going back to the verse in Surah An-Nisa, verse 34, the issue of wifely disobedience and hitting the wife, after going through other steps, if she still insists on doing whatever's considered disobedient, even among like classical scholars, they will read conditions into what does it mean, right? They'll say you cannot hit in a manner that leaves marks or these sorts of things. So we have plenty of precedent for reading in conditions sometimes, provided that doesn't contravene the sunnah, the hadith, and so forth. So it's not necessarily wrong to say that the daraja there, or the degree, is restricted if that can be upheld, generally speaking, without contravening other Islamic texts. So I think there is some precedent, but again, in terms of coming to that conclusion firmly, I think that does need some more research and looking into. So I'm not saying that's how it is, but perhaps there is some leeway there to do what you're asking.
And the second thing is, now it says that men are qawwamuna because of what they spend of their property. Now, if let's say there's a relationship where the woman is the bread earner, can there be a reversal of roles and obedience in that relationship?
This is not something that you find, again, in classical texts. There's no such thing as reversing obedience. The concept of obedience and of someone being qawwamun in classical texts is granted to the husband and not the other way around.
But could you say that that authority is at least diminished in that example?
Yeah, so again, you're rereading something, right? And we've just said, I think we've pretty much established by this point that yes, we do need to be looking at some of these readings and what can be done. As for the precise solution that's arrived at, that's another story, and you're putting out possibilities here.
Yeah, I think what Manu is asking too along those lines is like, what is negotiable and what is non-negotiable when it comes to these issues of gender, right? Looking at the big picture, because, like you said, nobody in history has ever said that the roles can be reversed. Does that allow us, though? Does that prevent us from looking at this, or does it say, well, maybe they never encountered these types of issues, or maybe they did, right? I mean, I just like the issue of spending. I just recalled the hadith of Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, radiallahu anhu, when his wife was the wealthy one and he was poor, right? Was the role reversed there, And in fact, she comes to the Prophet ﷺ and she asks, "Can I give him some of my wealth? Would it be counted as charity?" So she's literally giving her husband, but it's counting as charity. But I don't think. Anyways, I'm just thinking out loud here. Going back to the negotiables and the non-negotiables, what are your thoughts on that when it comes to these types of issues?
Yeah, I mean, there's certain issues that, of course, are much easier to negotiate than others. So just to choose a different example that we haven't touched on, something like witness requirements, right? Because the only Quranic verse, or maybe for those who are listening who aren't aware, let's just step backwards a little bit. Traditionally, jurists have generally said that a woman's testimony is half of a man's, that you need 2 women witnesses to fulfill the place of 1 male witness. The only Quranic verse, though, that deals with this is specifically is Ayatul Dain, so it's one very particular context where the idea of 2 female witnesses is raised. And the fact that a lot of jurists extended that all over the place, this is juristic reasoning. It's not necessarily required by the Quran. And you do also find a little bit of disagreement within the tradition, even though those disagreements were not the mainstream. But there is a lot of wiggle room there due to the, you don't have that much explicit in the Quran, and you do have a little bit of disagreement in the tradition. As for certain other things, I don't know, another example we can take.
Like the issue of inheritance, for example.
Yeah, inheritance.
A lot of people have said that's like a non-negotiable, right?
Yeah, I mean, that you start getting into more tricky territory there, of course, because now we do have very explicit verses, and you do have hadith as well on the issue of inheritance. As well, the fact that once you start getting into things like inheritance, marriage, divorce, everything is intertwined with each other traditionally. So once you start pulling out one building block, you have to be a little bit careful or figure out how everything's going to fit together in the system. So again, I don't necessarily have the solutions to this, but there are certainly issues that are easier to deal with than others.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So would it be fair to say that no matter how much if we want to stay true to the tradition, that no matter how much we try to interpret, we're always going to find that there's going to be an inherent ontological difference between men and women from the Islamic paradigm?
To a certain extent, I think you will find that there are going to be certain differences. But again, to what degree is a completely different story. And I don't think, there are, of course, certain people who believe that we need to interpret things to 100% match what modern Western thought is on gender. And there's no reason why that has to be the case. Of course, people who believe that, they already have their own paradigm with Islamic feminism. But I think it's actually a very good thing if Muslims can reach their own solution and middle ground. We have our own texts. At the end of the day, we do believe that the Quran is divine revelation. We do believe in the Sunnah. So the goal is not to reinterpret everything in a manner that simply matches what is the thought of the day in broader society. Saying that there is some leeway for reinterpretation to be responsive to modern society is different than saying let's make everything match, right, what the current trends are. So yeah, I do think that at a certain level you will find that there are going to be some differences that remain in certain things, in certain differences between men and women based on the text. Again, assuming you want to take the text at face value at a certain level. And that, I think, for mainstream Muslims is a healthy thing, but also, re-engaging with certain texts and engaging with a level of reinterpretation is also healthy.
And I think it goes without saying that, at least before God, in the eyes of God, the men and women are equal in every respect. It's just the rules that we've been given on earth would be what makes those slight differences between them.
Yeah, I mean, you're going to a very common trope right now in the Muslim community, right? Which is that, spiritually men and women are equal. And I mean, this is true. There's no reason to deny that, of course.
Just making it clear for our audience. That's all. I'll give it back to Anwar.
No, Jazakallah khair. Um, how would you talk to someone? So this is a hypothetical, like a young Muslim girl who is struggling with these, you know what I mean, different things that she's hearing, right? She's hearing on one side that Islam is inherently anti-women because of one, two, and three, right? And she sees like the way her family is behaving. She sees what's going on in the Muslim community. She sees how women, at least in apparent, are treated. What is there a message that we could give someone like that?
So I think, first of all, even though of course we're focusing on gender here, and it is very important to talk about gender without doubt and to not just sideline it, at the end of the day, this is not the message of Islam, right? It's not the core message of Islam. The idea of worshiping Allah, and like there's so much more to Islam than gender, and to just focus on gender is a mistake, just like sidelining it completely is a mistake. But sometimes if somebody, is maybe focusing all their energy on something just to remind them of the broader message of Islam, I think can be very helpful. And developing a spiritual connection, whether some people are, maybe they find a lot of spirituality in increasing their prayers or reading the Quran or whatever, but this is very important, and not to get sidelined just by gender, just like we shouldn't sweep it under the rug. As well, when we're dealing with something like gender, even though there's a lot of work to be done in this area, we are fortunate in the North American Muslim community that we do have certain masjids, Islamic centers, certain scholars who definitely take positions that I think are more in line with expectations of young modern Muslims, without going into all of these, without going to the extremes. I don't want to call it extreme, without going to the end of the spectrum that Islamic feminism is on. Even within the tradition, we do find a diversity of opinion, while recognizing that we need to look at certain opinions more. But for somebody who is already very disinclined towards a certain point of view, to point somebody like that in the direction of a masjid or a scholar that they're going to find a lot more benefit in, and that they'll find a lot more palatable, can also perhaps be beneficial.
Makes a lot of sense. Yeah, good.
I was just going to jump in. Just thank you, Dr. Lowe, for being here and sharing all your points. Thanks for teaching the class too, and I really encourage anyone to take the course. Join TISA. You're going to get more content like it. Some of the ideas was just a taster within this podcast, but believe me, the details that we went into is enormous, and you can only take the course to get the full scope of it.
Yeah, of course. So you just saved me from having to make some detailed closing remarks, because I think that
No
that does a good job. But I would definitely echo what you just said, which is that I look forward to. I don't currently have a class schedule, but inshallah, I look forward to seeing students in a full class. And for those who didn't take this class, again, I don't know when it'll be offered in the future, but I look forward to engaging with more students about these issues in more detail. And everything we said today, like you mentioned, these are things that we spent 12 weeks or so on together. So there's a lot more that can be said, and this is just like a small little tidbit of it.
Yep. Jazakumullah khair. Thank you so much for giving us some of your time. Thank you for answering a lot of our questions, and like I want to echo Manu. I enjoyed the class, immensely. It was definitely a learning experience for me. exploring new ideas, just putting yourself out there, being vulnerable, being open to different viewpoints, I think is definitely good. And then I think in terms of like the research, I plugged myself in. We did some stuff. It was good. Turning out papers every week. That's definitely
You're gonna
a workload.
discourage people rather than encourage them if you say
No, no,
that.
it's good. I mean, the work is what shapes you, right? When you put your ideas on paper, it helps shape those ideas so that you know what's actually in your brain. It's not just sitting there.
We
It's
only
true.
hear of that from when we're on record, not off records.
Well, now this
Yeah.
has been recorded in the next class, I'm gonna, I think, play this back for you guys.
There you go. No, khairan inshallah. Barakallah fikum. Jazakumullah khairan. Thank you so much. And we look forward to seeing you again all soon. And to our listeners, thank you for listening in. And we look forward to seeing you guys as well, inshallah ta'ala.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone.